So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Welcome back to those who have been with us before, and hello to some new faces. My name's Matthew Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for 11 and a bit years. I set up on my own 2.5 years ago as an independent recruiter and was given the nickname the Ethical Social Housing Recruiter, and have clung on to it as much as you can possibly imagine. But it's a badge of honor for me. And these roundtables, if you are new or if you're listening for the first time, they are free. They are open to all. They are every Tuesday, 11 till 12. And the idea is to have a respectful discussion about anything and everything in social housing, without agendas, without judgment, but also to ask sometimes those more difficult questions and probe more deeply into those areas that sometimes when you sit on some panels or when you go to some conferences, we just kind of talk around the subject. We don't really actually get to the core of the problem itself. I'm going to start doing something slightly different in my introductions. I'm going to start putting in the chat at the beginning of every week the mailing list. If you're not on the mailing list, it's in there now. Please feel free to sign up. Also, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, please feel free to. Always nice to for people on here to collaborate as well. Today's guest speaker, I'm pretty certain, and I'm sure Ollie will correct me if I'm wrong, was someone I met via LinkedIn, which is obviously an absolute shock to anyone and everyone who's ever been to the roundtables, because I could pretty much repeat that verbatim every week. And we just got chatting about an alternative solution to the private rented sector, because I think I put a post up about the private rented sector and how important it is actually in dealing with the housing crisis, and often gets left behind as a discussion point, and often is the piece which, even in legislation, when you go to the social housing supported regulation bill that's come out, the private rented sector is barely mentioned within it. And it's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre, because it's a huge impact on the sector as a whole. So Ollie and I got talking, did a bit of work together, actually used me for a bit of recruitment, which is fantastic. And then I kind of said to him, well, why don't you come on the roundtable, talk about what you're doing at the moment, but more importantly, the discussions you're having, the pushback you're getting on that private rented sector, but also actually the impact it's having positively. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ollie to introduce himself, and then I'm going to come and start the presentation when Ollie's ready. So Ollie, over to you. Great to have you with us today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt, and great to see you all. I am a social housing roundtable virgin, as it were. So despite Matt and I speaking a couple of months ago, this is the first one I've got onto, and typically it's the one I'm speaking at. So apologies there, Matt. I have watched a couple of recordings, but it's just the way the cookie crumbles, as they say. But yeah, so thank you for having me on. So I am founding director of the Living Housing Group, which is I would jump onto in the presentation if you want to bring it up, Matt. It's a collection of companies that is fundamentally founded in the private sector, but is all social housing means. So we do every part of social housing, everywhere through from sort of development to management to temporary accommodation to supporting our colleagues in supported accommodation. So if you want to jump to the next slide, Matt, we'll jump into sort of the structure of the group, and I'll just give some backstory as to who I am and what we do in the group, and then sort of jump onto today's topic. So just some context. So the group is made up of 5 companies, two of which are yet to be fully launched. But we've got Living Concepts that operates as a follow-on and temporary accommodation provider around the East Midlands. We provide sort of accommodation to around 100 people per night across 5 district councils across Lincolnshire. So that's most of that is in follow-on accommodation. So we provide follow-on accommodation to organisations such as NACRO, as well as taking duties to refer from local authorities such as South Kesteven and South Holland and stuff like that. So that was very much the founding business. We set that up about 4 years ago, and we have an intrinsic link to the private rented sector in that one. We lease all our accommodation. We don't own any of it. It's all leased from private sector landlords. Typically, most of that is a HMO setup or self-contained accommodation for those with sort of more complex needs, and then we use that in collaboration with the district councils. Living Redefined, which is sort of the most topical aspect, and the reason sort of for this conversation today. It's a nationwide property procurement company, specifically and exclusively working with central government functions, housing associations, and registered providers. That organisation's got commercial agreements for sort of about 25,000 bed spaces that need to be procured exclusively for social housing over the next 5 years. And I'll jump onto the next slide in a minute to sort of give some breadth as to who we work with. Fundamentally, we can't fix the problem without building. We're only re-slicing the cake, as it were. If we're using existing stock. So living development exists to convert empty commercial units. It hasn't done any sort of ground up developments yet, but again, it's based around the East Midlands. I'm up in Cleethorpes now at one, a 7-bedroom HMO that's going to be passed over to local authority to be used as temporary accommodation. So again, everything is for use of RPs, local authorities, HAs, whatever. But that's repurposing either vacant dwellings. We have some collaborations with district councils on some empty home schemes and stuff like that, as well as taking vacant commercial sites that are on the open market. And then Living Social will sort of aim to be a large stock holding body, essentially, that holds high quality private rented sector accommodation, and just provides another aspect into the market. And then Living Management will just be the sort of stockholder, the management company that will look after them all. So certainly when I founded the group, the name of the game was to be able to take a tenant all the way through from being homeless and sleeping on the street, so in our temporary accommodation units, in our follow-on accommodation units, and supporting them right the way through a journey to where they're engaged fully in the private rented sector with Living Social. And the name of the game for me is to be able to touch every part of that and to provide a sort of end-to-end solution, as I called it when we started it a few years ago, to homelessness. Typically, the goal for the organisation is to end homelessness in the UK, which I'm sure a lot of the organisations represented on the call today share that. But that's how I sort of founded it a few years ago. If you want to just jump on to the next one, Matt, this sort of just shows you, so across the group, the organisations that we're working with. I don't know if any of you on the call are from any of these organisations today, but we've got everything from sort of Serco and the Home Office dealing with the asylum seeker challenges. We've got the Housing Network and NACRO, where we support with CAS 2 and CAS 3 offender management, as well as various district councils and for supported living and veteran supported services and temporary accommodation and follow-on accommodation. So that just gives you some of the breadth as to the people that we're working with. As I say, everything is exclusively social housing. So whether it be fully supported services or commissioned services from central government functions, we don't do anything else. Everything is for local authorities or RPs. So just on the next slide, Matt, just some of the challenges and I suppose our mandate in the market as to some of the activities we're doing. So we've got 50,500 asylum seekers. It's a very topical one at the minute, put up in hotels in some form of temporary accommodation. The goal is that they're all in dispersed accommodation, of which there's obviously not enough of. So we have commercial agreements to support a number of those. We're working on about 180 bed spaces for CAS 2 programme in collaboration with NACRO. That's due to be delivered by March 24. 685 bed spaces of community accommodation CAS 3 that's required by the end of this year. There's about 200 supported living bed spaces required in the Midlands with some of our general needs providers and some more complex needs. And we're working with providers to provide about 1,500 bed spaces of temporary accommodation, mostly around the Midlands and the South, for family and self-contained stock for those local authorities that are still using a lot of B&B, a lot of travel lodge, in sort of unsuitable forms of temporary accommodation. So that gives you sort of a bit of breadth as to, we're working with all those organisations, but these are typically, we do a lot of stuff with the Ministry of Justice through NACRO and other providers, and we do quite a bit of stuff with, as you can see, with Serco and other ASC providers. So we're always active. We're always actively working with more people. We have, our teams are dealing with thousands of landlords every week. The way we engage with the private rented sector is quite unique. We've got a sort of full market access. We've got about 4,500 landlords and agents in our books that we're working with to lease accommodation from. And we're sort of providing, by the end of this year, we should be providing about 100 properties a month to various different providers for various different contracts for varying different uses. So yeah, that's a bit about what that hopefully sort of sums up some context. The next couple of slides is just to sort of kick off the debate and to talk about some of the issues. But I just sort of open it up if anyone got any sort of queries, questions on what we do and how we do it, before I sort of jump into the main bit of the discussion, as it were. No, that's
I
absolutely
think
fine.
you're good. I think you're good at the moment. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Nothing so far, but I'm sure
Magic,
that'll change
no
soon.
worries. Cool. So, this is so the next slide. Thanks, Matt. So certainly this is how we see it in the private rented sector. We don't sort of stand on, this is just us sort of reporting the facts. We don't stand in the market as an investor. We're not there as a landlord. This is just some of the real world facts that we see that is present in the PRS, and that's whether it be from a landlord or whether it be from a tenant's perspective. All of these things are common knowledge, and most of these things will equally affect tenants and landlords. We're speaking to sort of landlord bodies and tenant bodies, in the arena, and these are certainly some of the things that's coming up. I know many people will welcome the changes to Section 21 and the proposed abolishment of no fault evictions, but we have to be aware, and we've got to be sensitive as to, that's great for tenants, but there's, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and certainly from the conversations that we're having with our, sort of 3,000 phone calls that the team are making, is that the reality is landlords are worried because they're going to lose the flexibility of what they're going to do. And fundamentally, some of the arguments and some of the challenges that manifest in is that if we fundamentally lose some of the stock because landlords don't feel in control of their properties, then that lowers the options for renters and only drives rent up. So that's one of the sort of that's just some of the voices that we're hearing, some of the concerns, certainly from landlords, obviously, and landlord bodies, is that actually removing that flexibility, removing the what they can do with their property could have another reaction, an unintended consequence for tenants, as it were. But I'm sure that's a conversation point. We've got, certainly with interest rates and inflationary pressures in sort of the macroeconomic perspective, we've got landlords that typically would invest in buy-to-let, and stockholders, that large institutions and institutional investors that would hold large swathes of buy-to-let stock. The reality is that margins are being squeezed, and certainly a lot of landlords, as some of the later data will show, is that landlords and tenants are struggling with that. So certainly in a lot of marginal areas, especially down in the south, where margins and that cash flow each month is smaller already than it is compared to the north. In those marginal investment areas, we're certainly seeing that the reality is those traditional buy-to-let family homes are, landlords are exiting the market because their cost squeeze, rents don't rise in line with inflation. That's just a reality. It doesn't work like that. But their interest rates and their mortgages, certainly into Q3 and Q4 this year, when the majority of that sort of bell curve is to landlords who have got to refinance their assets and their fixed terms are coming to an end, this is when we're going to start to feel the shock. We've not really, in the landlord space, felt that shock yet, because when we look at the data, most landlords on that bell curve, on that distribution curve, they're refinanced. The end of their fixed term is sort of due in between Q3 this year and sort of by the end of Q2 next year. So this is, I think, when we're going to see a lot of the pain. But that's a real challenge. That fundamentally, if landlords can't afford to hold the asset because rents or whatever don't cover the cost of the mortgage, then again, it's just going to be more departures from the private rented sector. We've got a lot of, so certainly this is not a particularly well-known statistic, but there's a huge majority of landlords in the marketplace who you could probably define as accidental landlords, or not necessarily professional landlords. And I suppose the concern from a lot of angles is that as tenants and mental health becomes more prevalent and more challenging, and more people feel the effects of it, it's more spoken about, landlords certainly feel out of their depth to deal with those challenges. 43% of landlords owned a rental property, but they represent only 20% of tenancies. So a lot of landlords aren't professional landlords. They're either you've inherited a property and they think it's a great idea that they're going to rent that out, or they've just bought one property while they do their sort of corporate day job. They're not informed in the loop. They're certainly seeing challenges, and they're dealing with unknowns as to how to deal with the various support needs that tenants might need who are in the PRS. And as mental health becomes a more important topic in society day to day, certainly a lot of landlords feel challenged because it's not their main day job, it's not their main focus, and that's just another added layer of complexity, along with regulatory reform and all those types of things, and rising interest rates. So again, it's just another concern that landlords are speaking about. It's another theme of conversation. as we know, the cost of living crisis, it's hitting tenants and it's hitting landlords equally. The Guardian reported in May 23 that over 700,000 households in the UK missed or defaulted on a rent or mortgage payment in April alone. And that's 2 million households missed or defaulted on a mortgage payment, a rent, a loan, a credit card bill in April as well. So, the reality is, it just ties into the last point on the slide. These issues don't just affect landlords, don't just affect tenants, they affect landlords as well. As if you think of it as a supply chain, it all knocks onto each other. It's a domino effect. So certainly the issues that we see with tenants and the rise in rent arrears, that's passed on to landlords, but equally, where you've certainly got those 43% of landlords who own one property, they may be starting to look at their corporate job subsidising their property income if their property income isn't covering their mortgage. They've had to remortgage, or their tenant is in arrears. So these are just all sort of dynamics that are playing out, and our teams are when we're speaking with landlords, when we're speaking with agents, these are the types of things that are coming up in conversation. And the reality is, the PRS is critical to ending homelessness, because it's fundamentally the free market of accommodation supply in the UK. But also there's a number of HAs, local authorities, RPs, that lease a vast amount of this stock. And certainly speaking to a number of our providers, the attrition rate since the cost of living crisis has sort of taken hold and interest rates have skyrocketed, the attrition of their rental books, which is the platform they provide their support from, has increased, hugely. Where providers having to put significantly more money into either higher rents or additional procurement, because landlords are fundamentally selling up their properties. So there's an absolutely intrinsic link between, what's happening in, how everything's playing out in the PRS, to how that sort of links into the tenant experience, the length of tenancies, the challenges with tenancies, and how many properties are available to supported living and stuff like that. So, these are issues which may be sort of landlord centric, but they certainly have ripple effects around for everyone in the marketplace. The next one, Matt. This is just, I suppose, this is just the final slide, really, and just to maybe kick off a bit of the discussion. These are just some commonly spoken about ways, and some of my views in here as to maybe how the PRS can help end homelessness. It's my firm belief that the PRS, if it wants to do more, a conscious private rented sector, can fundamentally end homelessness. There's not just one way to fix it, but the PRS certainly has more in it than it can do to support end homelessness. But there's, as I mentioned, around tenant type and the challenges with tenancies and stuff like that, there's certainly closer collaboration between whether they're non-profits or local authorities, whatever, but support services and landlords. It is a big one where landlords feel out of their depth and rush to enforcement action when they see rents not being paid, or they don't know how to handle a situation. So they think the only way out is just to evict the tenant and move on. The reality is, if we can tie that closer relationship up between organisations such as We Are With You, or local authorities, or whoever those support agencies are, the job centres, then it provides a bit of a lever to be able to mediate some of the challenges that landlords are facing when dealing with their tenants. And hopefully that then changes the timeline between, it puts another step of mediation in before enforcement action happens. And if we can extend or make tenancies more sustainable by making that support more known by landlords and property owners and whoever, and try and tie up those gaps, then hopefully that means that less tenants are evicted and more problems can be solved in the interim. Likewise, tenants, certainly one of the things we're seeing is, with all the cost changes and all the interest rate challenges, certainly a thing that we're offering is, obviously we're offering landlords to be able to lease their properties to housing associations and local authorities. As big as this is, it's still a hugely unknown and slightly feared, and very landlords are certainly very skeptical of leasing houses to providers. They understand the tenant types, they don't understand the pitfalls, they don't understand the advantages. And actually, certainly those providers that we see on commission services who aren't sort of tagged to LHA rates can offer a very competitive rent because of how it's funded and how they've done their tender or whatever. And we certainly are trying to encourage landlords, rather than exit the market, if the private rented sector isn't working for you, then there's another way to operate in the market, and that may be if there's fears around the tenant, and that may be that they hand that off to a housing association who can manage that, and they offer a lease on the property, or just various different ways that, rather than a landlord exiting because they're worried of Section 21 or they've got challenging tenants or whatever, this is just another way we can keep the asset in the private rented sector, but make it available for it to be used, because house purchasing is as unaffordable as it's sort of ever been now, and it's not getting any easier. So to put more properties up for sale isn't fundamentally helping the issue. The smaller we shrink the private rented sector, in my view, we're not fixing the problem. And then there's the age-old crime of there's 530,000 houses in the UK that are either registered as second homes or long-term void stock. I know from speaking to a number of local authorities around where we work and some of the empty home strategies that we're involved in. And local authorities aren't aware of their enforcement action. They're not aware of their powers. They're not enforcing on empty properties or second dwellings. And there are hundreds of thousands of properties sat there that could be bought, regenerated through whether that's a link to institutional investment or just getting them out in auction, getting them out to investors who are going to buy them, or whoever it is. There's 530 homes there. We aren't aware of the percentage of how much of that is second homes, but there's certainly hundreds of thousands of void properties. I know from speaking to my local authority, who I won't name, but they've got 1,200 properties empty in their local authority, and there's one man allocated to it. It's not enough, and it's in my view it's a crime. But there must be a way to incentivize the regeneration. There's the sale of, disposal of, whatever of those properties to bring back into the PRS or put to the open market, or just have them regenerated so somebody can live in it. So that was just sort of my 50 pence as to some of the ways we can some of the ways that we can fix the issues in the private rented sector. Some of the issues are well above my pay grade, as it were, at macroeconomic level of interest rates and all that sort of stuff. But there are certainly things we housing associations, local authorities and landlord bodies to try and bridge the gap, to increase the length of tenancies, mediate issues before they get to enforcement action, and just change some of the policies around empty homes and stuff like that would certainly see a benefit. How big that benefit is, I don't know, but that's certainly some of the things that we see day to day. But look, if there's any questions, I'd love to get the discussion started and hear what people think.
Thank you, Ollie, and thanks for providing, I guess, a flip side to the narrative. I think quite often there can be a disconnect, I think, between housing providers and the private rented sector. I think understandably, I think a lot of time the profit that can go on, and I certainly think the media narrative around the private rented landlords at the moment isn't particularly brilliant. I think there's a lot of particularly young people or people struggling to get into the housing market going, well, if there's that much of a struggle, why don't they sell their homes, because we'll buy them, and then bring the house cost down a bit because we'll have more supply, etc., etc. But as you pointed out, I think during bits of your presentation there, that isn't necessarily the right solution, and it isn't necessarily the only solution, and there definitely needs to be more collaboration between the two. Sabani's put in the chat there a question, which I'm going to read in a minute. If anyone has got questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat, or if you're comfortable to do so, please raise your hand, because I think this is a really interesting debate. And the private rented sector, there is certainly a place for it in supporting housing sector in the UK, but the costs sometimes just aren't feasible for anybody who's even working who isn't in social housing, never mind someone who needs the support linked to it. So the question from Sabani: there is not enough knowledge and assurance to the private rented sector to rent to providers. So how are you going about establishing that confidence for landlords?
It's a great question. It's a battle we have every day. As I say, our teams are making sort of 500-600 outbound phone calls every day to landlords, letting agents. There's a huge education piece that needs to be done. I haven't got the answer. We're working with organisations such as the NRLA to try and do some sort of partnership around, how can we educate people? It's really around. I suppose a lot of what we do is we demonstrate through how we work. So we'll always have landlord testimonials. We'll always share. Because of the commercial arrangements we have in the marketplace as a sourcer, we can share who our clients are, who the providers are. We work with a lot of people are unfortunately a little bit shady in the marketplace, and they do back-to-back leases and try and make bits in the middle, and you end up making it worse, because you're passing stock over, but people are having this lease with this limited company, and then it goes to them, and it's just all not great. We operate in a very transparent way, so hence I can tell you, sort of as I did on the slides, who we work with. So we've got direct contact links between landlords and sort of the landlord services teams and within the providers. And it's really an education piece. We're totally upfront. The leases are shown up front and all that sort of stuff. But there is a huge education piece. People are there's a huge disconnect. What we see, providers put what they think is to be amazing offer, but landlords take it very differently. So, for example, every provider thinks, yeah, we'll give a 5-year lease. Well, actually, a 5-year lease to a majority of landlords is a crap offer, because I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years. I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 minutes time, let alone what I'm going to be doing in 5 years. So they see it. So providers think that's great, because we're providing guaranteed rent for an extended period of time, and that's amazing. That's what all landlords want. But the reality is, certainly from the landlords that we speak to and the stuff in the open market, with letting agents, the traditional rented stuff, people go, well, I just want to do a 6-month tenancy. I want to do a 6-month tenancy. I want the flexibility. I don't know where I'm going to be in a year. I don't know what interest rate it's going to do. I don't know what the time, what's going to happen to my life within that 5 years. So you certainly have a disconnect. We certainly see that providers think they're offering something great, but they're not twigged into the market that they're operating in. So, does somebody want to fix it a rent now when they've just seen interest rates go up, and their mortgage go up 4 or 5-fold or whatever, and there's no rent rise provision in it, things like that. So we just see a bit of a commercial disconnect between the providers that we work with and the marketplace they're trying to operate in, which is typically why, in our view, there is a procurement issue sometimes. We're speaking with providers and we're dealing with providers who need all this stock and they're not getting it, but they just think there's no properties there. There are, but what they're offering isn't what the consumer wants, if that makes sense. So it's going to be an ongoing piece. It's not going to be fixed anytime soon, but it's just continually talking about it.
Thanks, thank you so much. If I may quickly ask on the back of that, how much do you see is the flexibility from providers to adjust to what is available on the stock, and how much the landlords are bending? What do you see the flexibility there?
When you say, what do you mean by the flexibility? Sorry.
You just gave an example where the provider is giving for 5-year lease, and the landlord may not be interested in that long. So is there enough openness for discussion and change from the providers, or?
Yeah, so certainly, I operate our organisations on a principle of, we don't make decisions, we offer everything. So if we've offered a 5-year rent and the landlord comes back and says, I only want to do 6 months, we always put that on the table. But certainly some providers, I think, depending on the service that they're operating, certainly a lot of the supported living stuff we're doing, where there's a lot of capital investment up front, we're converting sort of C3 residential dwellings into HMOs. Fundamentally, there needs to be a payback period. So it very much depends. If we're just using it for temporary accommodation and they're putting 4 beds in it and some bedside tables and a kitchen pack, then that upfront investment allows, because it's quite small, it allows us to be flexible with, okay, well, let's just do an 18 months then. Let's do a 3-year, but with a break. We try and offer break clauses, so we get the commitment for 3 years, because the reality is they probably forgot about the break clause that they had at 12 months after they've, by the time you thought about it again. So there's a couple of creative things we do around break clauses, but it very much depends on the service that's being offered as to how much capital investment the provider's putting in, therefore what's their payback time before they can make themselves a surplus and it be a sustainable activity. So it very much depends on the service it's working on. But generally, the providers that we work with, there's a level of pragmatism as to go, well, we can't do it for 6 months, but we'll put a break clause in for everyone, or we'll take a bit of a risk here. I suppose it depends on how much you need the stock and how much risk you're willing to take.
I'm aware we've got a few questions. I'm going to keep kind of bouncing through. Joe, I'm going to bring you in first before I jump to the chat. There's some stuff that's come up there too. So Joe, over to you.
Hi there. Hi, Ollie. I've got a couple of questions which I'll try and whiz through. So I work probably really quite similarly to you. My background is in commercial property, repurposing back to housing and leasing to the charity sector. I've moved over to Julian House in January specifically to deal with the procurement of property for their contracts, their supported housing contracts. Firstly, obviously, you're working on CAS 3, which we are too, but a lot of our other contracts are linked to housing benefit, local housing allowance rates. Are you procuring most of your property at above market rent value? Because obviously that, certainly in my sector, is fine when you've got a contract that is spot funded to cover that, but not fine when we're looking at all of our other contracts. And it kind of doesn't necessarily sit right with me that we're having to offer more than open market rent levels in order to secure properties for supported housing. So that's sort of question number one. And then also, secondly, how are you, with some of your smaller landlords, how are you dealing with the issue of the block on the mortgage provider for things like a company let housing tenancy agreement or a lease arrangement?
So if I go back to the first one, most of the stuff we do is with commission services and tender contracts and stuff like that. So there is the flexibility of going above. Typically, we don't go above the market rent. We don't have to. If all of my contracts were based on LHA rate, I wouldn't have a business and wouldn't be talking to you now. That's the reality. But I don't think that's a fault of the market. I think if my view is anything to go by, that is a fault of LHA rates haven't changed in however long. And the reality is you can't procure anything on LHA rate. One of the businesses that we've got, the stuff that we provide private sector, homeless and follow-on accommodation, that is tagged to LHA rate. So we operate HMOs with the local authorities that is tagged to LHA rate. And in a large majority of areas, there is no business to be done because it's not sustainable. So, there is we work with the Housing Network, who I believe you work with down in, Weston-super-Mare and Bristol Way and stuff like that. So that's one of our major clients for CAS 3. And we're not necessarily offering above market rent. What I would certainly say on offering above market rent, and this is where providers have the disconnect between what they believe they're offering is amazing and what what the market certainly thinks. If you are offering a company let to a property, you are bottom of the pile. So it is the reality. Providers think that they're offering a 5-year self-repairing, that's all great. Landlords, that's not necessarily what landlords want. And this is again the disconnect, because so many landlords are the accidental landlords that don't really understand what a company let is. If I've got a GP who's going to pay 12 months rent in up front, or I've got a company let who's going to do 5 years guaranteed rent, if I've never done a company let before, I'm definitely going to go with a GP, because why would I take the risk when that choice is easy? Why would I take the risk with something that I've never done before? Why would you take that risk with your prized possession, your asset, you're emotionally valued about it, you're emotionally charged with it? So sometimes you have to buy yourself into the market by going, okay, I will offer you another 50 quid more, or I will do that. And sometimes that's what we have to do, certainly in the West Midlands, where we're seeing a lot of procurement challenges at the minute. We are having to buy ourselves in because the competition is unbelievable. I was speaking to an agent in Grantham. I mean, if any of you know where Grantham is, it's not incredible. But 150 applications for a 1-bed flat. And if you're a provider going, yeah, we're a company let and we support offenders coming out of prison, I don't think it takes a genius to work out where you're on the list, and it's the opposite from the top. So that sometimes, money talks is the reality in a free market, and that's it's one of the levers that we've got to do. What we know is the data of our pipeline says when we speak with a landlord, what we offer is the best thing since sliced bread. When we deal with an agent, it's the worst thing in the world. And so a lot of our resources go on, well, how do we speak to more landlords rather than speak to agents? And agents are instrumental to our business, but they are unknown. And don't forget, if I sort of take it back to a marketing, we're playing Chinese whispers, because I've got somebody on the phone who's telling a letting agent what they think, and that letting agent's going to talk to their boss. Do we do company lets? And then they're going to revert their opinion in their conversation with the landlord. Go, we've got this offer from their own accommodation provider, and I've had a look at their balance sheet, and there's nothing really on it, and and all these conversations. And actually, you're not the one that's able to tell the story. So sometimes sometimes you do have to buy your way into the market. And we see that, but typically we don't have to pay a market rent. But as I say, I wouldn't have a business if we had to do everything on LHA rate. And then just
go on, Ollie, please.
And then the second part was remind me what the second.
Well, I think we kind of addressed all of it. Well, but those first two parts of the question. So whether you were specifically going over market rent value in order to get landlords on board, and then obviously we were talking about the mortgage provider being a block to anything other than a standard an AST. Yeah.
It certainly happens. In certainly all of the leases, and so. We operate a very clear distinction between our obligations and the obligations of our client, i.e. the provider, and the obligations of a landlord. If a landlord doesn't have the correct insurance or doesn't have the correct mortgage, we make sure we've told them, and we make sure they understand. And we do get a lot of feedback that says, I can't do this because my mortgage doesn't allow it, or I've had a check. But the reality is some landlords don't care. But we ensure that the clients that we're working with, the leases that we're operating with, that is a fundamental obligation of the landlord, because at the end of the day, we can't mitigate everything. We were working with I was amazed at the due diligence of a client the other day, because they wrote to me about an EICR that had been carried out by a certified installer, but not a certified assessor. Well, I mean, that level of due diligence is unheard of. So for us, we're operating, we're bringing on sort of 50 to 100 properties a month. And we're dealing with sort of 3,000 to 5,000 phone calls a week. People have to be held responsible for their own due diligence at some point. We make sure it's clear what the property is being used for and all that sort of jazz. But if you're going to do all of your due diligence and everything, if you're going to take responsibility for everything, then you're not going to get any properties. There has to be a line in the sand which goes, well, I've told you what I was using it for. If you've entered a lease into a lease that breaks the covenants of your mortgage or breaks the covenants of your insurance, then that is a liability that you have to suffer, because that you've entered this, and I've shared with you. We don't ask to see mortgage documents, we don't ask to see buildings insurance, but we certainly make it clear that in the leases this is being used as part of the CAS 3 program, or this is being used for these types of things. So it is a challenge. I think a lot of landlords are more and more aware of it. But we certainly strike a line that actually, where our responsibility and your responsibility sits, there is a definitive line, and people have to be held responsible for their own actions, sort of thing.
Yeah. I've got an invite coming up to the Lloyds Banking Group to have a discussion about products specific to our industry for landlords. So if we've got landlords that want to remain sort of socially ethical, and that they can access, particularly in this sort of market at the moment with the rise in interest rates, looking at whether they can develop products specific for those landlords at lower interest rates. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that conversation goes, and whether we can make any real change to the products on offer to these landlords.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be great. Certainly from the developments that we've got, for example, stuff that we're doing for asylum, we're hugely penalised on the perception that it's a bigger risk. Well, actually, for me, it doesn't change the asset value. The lease has got a very strong covenant behind it, backed by a £3.5 billion company. I mean, how is that more of a lending risk than it is, versus an AST tenant that might be reliant on universal credit to get their income? I don't understand. I don't get it. So look, if we can connect afterwards, it'd be a really interesting conversation to sort of hear how it goes and whatnot.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Claire, I'm going to bring you in, then I'm going to the chat unless someone else wants to dive in. But Claire, over to you. Good to have you with us today. Can't hear you at all. Oh, got you now. Oh, that's working now. Yep.
Got me. Imran's going to be fed up of me.
Just a little bit quiet. You might want to go a little bit closer to the mic. That's all.
It is very weird. Turn that up as well. Does that work?
Yeah, that's good.
I can hear you.
Got me. Cool. This is fascinating, Ollie. This is really interesting. I've actually been on the other side of this, and I just want to. I got kicked out. My internet died for a minute, so I might have missed a bit. But are you sort of being a middle person between landlords, sort of the owner of the home, and housing associations?
Absolutely, yeah. So we are a broker of supported living to a landlord, if you want to put it that way. People come to us and they go, right, I've got this house. What should I do with it? Obviously, that we do that in a outbound way. We take ourselves to the markets and go, right, we've got a mandate for this in the market, and this is what we need. However, the term middleman, we don't sit in the middle of any leases. We operate in a very but certainly a lot of the people in the marketplace do. They'll sign a lease and they'll sign off a deed, a 5-year rent for a property that's not theirs, and then they try and mirror the rent, and they take a cut in the middle. Well, I was very clear when we set up the organisation that we had to do something different. That the sourcing market is very shady, very skulky, nobody really knows who the landlord is. It's crap, if you ask me. So we spent thousands on lawyers and developing a commercial agreement that would allow us the security to say, look, this is who we work with and this is who we've got, but protects us in the middle. So, we're only ever paid by the provider. So we are a commission service by a provider. We work on behalf of them. They are our client, and a landlord is the person we need to do the business. So we act as a middleman, but in a very open and transparent way.
Yes, sort of introducing them. I was just really interested about you saying that you don't look at the mortgage documents and that kind of thing to say, that it's a buy-to-let lease, buy-to-let mortgage and everything, because I did this recently, years and years ago, with a provider. So we were private landlords. My husband and I owned a house and we leased it to Wolverhampton Homes.
Yeah, and
they were a nightmare to deal with. They wanted to see every single piece of paper. So I was just wondering, just kind of how you deal. And actually, but with Wolverhampton Homes, actually what they've done is they've just stopped doing private rented sector. So I'm interested to hear, are there more housing associations coming on board, or more coming off?
No, so we are only growing. If I took us a year ago, our pipeline would look massively drier than it does today. We're constantly onboarding new housing associations and people that want to grow. And as I said, we work to their mandate, right? So we act as a bit of a, if you want to do this, you need to do this. If you want to do this, you need to do that. I was only having a conversation around a CAS 2 contract around. We have a bit of you can't have a property down a dead end. And I said, well, if you don't have a property down a dead, if you allow properties down dead ends, if we can consult with the MOJ around having what is the risk and if you can manage that risk, then we can create a huge, so you'd be amazed how many properties are down a dead end and how much stuff that turns off. So there's stuff like that. We act as a bit of a consultancy by going, well, okay, well, these are it's cause and effect sort of thing. If you did this, then you get this. But we act to the we operate to how the housing association wants us to operate. So if we had a provider that said you need to provide all your insurance documents, all of this, we go, that's fine, but don't really expect many houses, because you're just not going to get people that are going to go through the process. You're already at the bottom of the pile. Now you've managed to work your way to the pile. You've offered a bit more rent. You've got in the door, and now you want to change mortgage product. You need to change your insurance, this and that. We describe it as you're just creating more barriers to the process. We don't have any providers that say this is what we need. It's just the standard EICR, gas safe, EPC, and then if it's HMO, the license, stat compliance, and all that sort of stuff. We don't have any providers who go to the lengths that Wolverhampton Homes went to in your example. But I suppose it depends on where the providers set their line of what risk they're willing to take. Who they're fundamentally answering to, and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose it depends on the risk appetite of the provider.
So you are seeing more providers coming into this. It's just that with Wolverhampton Homes closing their programme, I was like, are others doing this? Or
we are seeing growing all of the time. I was speaking with a provider a couple of weeks ago. They want 20 to 40 properties a month. We are seeing more and more commission services come through. I just think the reality is providers don't have the and if anyone works in a provider in the property side of it, I don't think providers have the market knowledge in the space, and that provides such a huge procurement gap. I was literally speaking with a client the other day, and they said, we don't bid for contracts because we don't have any confidence that we can get the properties. Well, that's the sort of void we fill, because if, you know, as I said to this client, if we can fill the property requirement, if you can have confidence that we can fill whatever you need property-wise, as long as the rents are sensible in the tender and all this sort of stuff, how many more contracts would you bid for? You know, and it was very much the sky's the limit for them, because they can spread what they do around, but they were limited because they didn't feel they could procure the properties. Now, they're more than able to do so, but they just don't have the knowledge. They have a huge property team, they don't have the knowledge of how to operate in the market. A lot of providers act as, we just sit here and everyone comes to us. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. You know, everyone else is going to everyone. You have to start the conversation first, as opposed to just sit there and go, right, we're all high and mighty, this is what we do, we offer a 5-year guaranteed rent, come and knock on our door. Nobody comes knocking, unfortunately. The marketplace isn't you've got to be knocking on doors. You can't wait for people to knock on yours.
Brilliant, thank you.
Glenn had put in the chat that he's on the board of a social housing association that is keen to add to their stock. So how can we connect with private landlords in our area who are looking to exit?
In terms of exit, what do you mean? Those landlords looking to sell, or those landlords looking for an alternative way?
You're welcome to come in, Glenn. He's just put in the chat, I think, looking to sell.
All right, okay. I suppose that you've got to find a way to have a conversation with them first. That's always the difficult bit. Direct marketing with landlords and property owners is inherently difficult, because you can't set up Facebook ads as landlords, because people don't. It's not an identifiable factor. When we look at it, marketing, it's easy with HMOs because every local authority has a register, and you can identify those people. You have addresses. Being a landlord, people, unless goes back to 43% of stock owners hold 20% of tenancies and aren't professional landlords. So they're not the type of people you look on LinkedIn and go, right, oh yeah, they work in housing, because their corporate job at Royal Mail or whatever is their primary thing, and they've just got this accidental home. So the first challenge that you have is speaking with those people, whether that's through networking events, whether that's through just building the association's brand out there and making it very prominent that you are looking for properties, whatever. You've got to get fingers in pies and know people and get, and it's, you know, it's driving a conversation. Well, why are you selling? Because those typical ones of, well, I'm worried about Section 21, my interest rate is gone and my rent doesn't cover it, I've had a bad experience with a tenant, all those types of things. They're all things that you can mitigate, and you can go back and say, well, actually, don't worry about Section 21. It doesn't affect the company there. Well, why don't you let us take all that risk, because we manage our tenants in this way? So, well, you know, we go to the extent of explaining how our tenancies are managed with providers, such as, well, our tenants are on license agreements because they're in, you know, temporary housing and this and that, and actually that means a very different thing. And if the tenant causes an issue, you've got fears around the tenant type, but there's a very different set of recourse there because they're not on an AST. So it's around, you know, building that education piece of, you know, first your challenge is you've got to speak to them, but you'll be surprised once you can speak to them, the amount of things you can control that they didn't think could be controlled. But the challenge is, by the time they've put it on the market and you're speaking to them, they've already got it in their mind. They've spoken to their financial advisor, they've told their mortgage company, whatever, that they're destined to sell. And you got to get him. You got to plant the seed more upstream than you have once there's that purple brick sign outside the door that says, right, we're selling now. Because, you know, once people have gone down that track, there's very little turning them back. So it's you know, it's getting in. Where do you operate, Glenn? Where are you based?
On the
Wirral. Oh, okay, in the Wirral. Do you? Oh, I've got loads of stock in the Wirral. Do you operate on the other side? Do you operate in Liverpool as well, or is it just on the Wirral?
Just the Wirral.
Just the Wirral. Okay. Look, pin events, property events, anything, landlord shows, whatever. I think there's a residential landlord show up in Manchester next week or something. It's all right. Get yourself to that, and you know, you'll be amazed the amount of landlords that you speak to who are interested in what housing associations say. It's just that once people are looking to sell, they're potentially too far down the track. But reach out to me, Glenn. I can introduce you to a letting agent who's got about 900 units in Liverpool and on the Wirral. So it might be a useful connection for you.
Thank you, Ollie. Yasmin, who I know had to bounce, unfortunately said that she feels like the private rented sector has been allowed to inflate rents and there's little control over the quality of their properties. Before I go to some of the other points, I imagine, Ollie, that's something that is a constant challenge, and certainly from Birmingham, if I look at the supported exempt accommodation sector, everything that's gone on here, people in the private sector who've tried to get onto this, found loopholes, and are just converting properties to completely unsuitable means and just sticking people in to earn money. Is that a big challenge you're finding as well with the landlords you're trying to liaise with, people approaching you that are actually, for want of a better term, unscrupulous?
Oh, 100%, 100%. We have landlords that, forgive my French, take the piss. And we're not interested in working with those people. We want one of our Living Redefined's sort of go-to line is we are the home of the conscious landlord. We are there for landlords who want to make a difference, maybe don't know how, or they want to they can feel a benefit of renting their property in a different way. We are Living Redefined is known as the home of the conscious landlord. They are aware of what they are doing, and fundamentally we just don't work with them. We're not interested in those people that want that extra £25, extra that £50. If it's something we really need, then we'll consider it, but at the end of the day we'll just, one of my business partner Jack was speaking with the landlord the other day and he was like, yeah, I can get £1,000, we have to do £950 and I can get £1,000 with a private tenant. Okay, crack on. Sometimes it's just blowing their, popping the balloon, and they won't do it because they've got no management. And it's the education piece going, well, okay, yes, you can get more, but then take your 8% off with your agent, take your repairs off, take this off, take that off, and let's boil it down to net numbers rather than gross numbers, because the gross can always look better, in AST world, in the open market. But it's net that matters. It's what comes in your pocket at the end of each month. But I suppose the only thing I would push back against that is around, the private rented sector has been allowed to inflate rents. If you've got 150 properties, if you've got 150 applicants, whether it's 30 applicants, 100 applicants, whatever, if you've got a number of applicants for a property, people will compete with themselves because there is the desperation in the market. So, any landlord is going to take the highest rent because if people have offered that, they're clearly willing to pay it. And I suppose it's sometimes my only pushback is that sometimes it's certainly passed on to the landlord is that the market is pushing at rents. Well, actually, it's just sometimes it's confluence of circumstance in the market. It's the reality of, well, if you've got 150 people applying for a flat that's £500 a month, there's going to be a number of people that are going to have 525 or 550 or 12 months in advance. And because there are so few choices in the market, that's just market economics. And that's unfortunate.
I think one of the key problems, and it comes back to the point with the homelessness piece that you mentioned before, is that the big issue is we just don't have enough homes. So the private rented sector has to be involved in this because we don't have enough homes available. And as you put, like second homes and things like that, having a big impact. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to try and whistle stop through the last few questions before we run out of time and final thoughts. So, Tony Bradley, could you not lease the properties from one of your companies that the landlord wants to sell and use the rental to offset the lease costs? Is that something you've considered at all?
Just explain that again.
Could you not lease the properties from one of your companies that the landlord wants to sell and use the rental to offset the lease costs?
We don't lease anything direct.
I didn't think you did.
So we don't do no back-to-back leases. We don't sit in the middle of anything. The provider will pay what they're willing to pay. There are some interesting things coming on. I don't know whether it's growing, but I certainly know there's more talk of sort of rent to buy. I know there's a bit of that going on at the minute. I know it has been around for a while, but there's bits and bobs like that. But we see a huge divide between HAs that are looking to buy and build because they've got that funding from Homes England or wherever they get it from, and those providers doing commission services and they need to lease. A lot of the reason we see providers leasing accommodation rather than purchasing it is because of the timeframes. If we look at Cash 3 was awarded, the most recent award was, I think it was back in May, June, and that's due to be done by October. It's not going to be, it's more like at the end of December. So if you need 700 bed spaces in such a short period of time, there's no way, unless you've got some institutional capital behind you, that you're going to be able to buy all that stock. So providers are certainly getting more creative, but it's quite a regulated market. There's only so many things that you can do. But the drive is always time. Every contract that's tendered has financial penalties for if you've not hit it in time. And providers are they're incentivized to get the homes over the line. That's why leasing works for so many.
Question from Lee Crawshaw. I'm with Supported Living Gateway and we offer a similar service. We also offer property training in the social housing sector and to landlords. So I think there's some synergy between our two companies. So that's something that, again, I'm noticing there a lot of kind of partnerships already growing, which is brilliant to see. And Claire had said, being a landlord, we only knew about the private rented sector program at Wolverhampton Homes through another landlord. They certainly didn't seem to advertise their PRS program. Do you find that like I mean, I find that unfortunately a lot of RPs aren't great at advertising in general. Like they'll put that out, but trying to advertise their own culture or their values or why you should come work for them, or actually the good stuff they do isn't brilliant. So do you think there's an issue with private landlords, with RPs and housing providers in general, advertising they want to engage with the private rented sector?
Yeah, 100%. I suppose, and I'll caveat this with, I suppose that maybe, in the boardrooms of RPs and HAs, the more you advertise something, the more it looks commercial. That may be a consideration. If you're going to go, we want to rent homes, we want to do this, to be heard in the marketing space, to be heard on Facebook, to get traction, you've got to be really quite, you've got to think of your taglines, and that's quite a sensitive issue and sensitive subject for HAs as to how they look and how they operate around the market. But it is the old, it's the example I gave earlier. So many of our providers, or so many of the providers that we're aware of in the marketplace, they sit and wait for people to come to them. That may have worked 20, 30 years ago. It doesn't work now when you've got 150 applicants for a one-bed flat. It doesn't. You have to be out knocking on doors. You can't wait for people to knock on doors. When I look at some of the outreach and some of the outbound stuff that providers do, it's virtually non-existent. And then the irony is, and this is where the headspace is changing, because not only getting the lead is a difficult thing, but it's then executing on the lead is the challenging thing. So, when a lot of providers have been used to people buying for them, so they go, I'm going to buy you a home, and how would you like it doing? And I'm going to renovate it, and this, that, and the other. Well, when you go out and actively are procuring in the market, you used to be in a headspace of, well, people are going to buy it for us, therefore they'll do it to our spec. So if we want a CCTV system in, we'll just say we're not going to take it without a CCTV system, and then there's an incumbency on the landlord to do it because they purchased it for me, therefore this is the spec I need it to. When you're going out into the lettings market, people are presenting their stock and they're offering it to you. Do you want it? And it's very much a take it or leave it. So we have a number of providers that think they can go out in this old marketplace of people buy us properties and we tell them the spec that they want to do it to. When you go out into the lettings market, that people are giving it, people are saying this is what it is, take it or leave it. And it's another challenge when people go around and go, well, we'd like this doing, we'd like that doing, we'd like this. Well, but the other 149 applicants of the property will take it as is. It's
a very quick last question, Ollie, on that, because we're literally out of time. But what locations do you work in? It was just a final question from Imran.
We work all over the UK, so wherever there's a requirement, we have our teams. Our teams are based in Manchester, but we work nationwide with a number of providers. So,
thank you so much. Sorry to cut you off. I'm finding that, like I say, time has run out. We could have gone on there, and certainly hope this is something we can pick up again. There's certainly an interest, I think, in this space and trying to get this conversation moving forward. So, I just want to say a massive thank you to you for coming on board today, for bringing an insight and trying to look, like I say, at that other side of the mirror. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one that felt it was really, really interesting. So thanks, Ollie, and thanks to the whole team for today.
Beautiful. Thanks all. Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome. See you all again soon.
Have a good rest of the day.
We'll be up soon. Take care.